5 Live Formula One.
Good afternoon and welcome along to live coverage of the Belgian Grand Prix weekend ahead of the 12th race this season and the last before Formula One's summer break. We have free practice one ahead of us, and it's a sprint weekend as well, which means we only have one practice session before we go straight into Grand Prix qualifying. Saturday then consists of the sprint shootout, that's qualifying for the sprint, before the sprint race later that afternoon. A reduced amount of laps, less points on offer, and no mandatory pit stops. Sunday, business as usual with Grand Prix qualifying. The big question mark at the moment is around the weather. It is raining in Spa, the longest circuit on the calendar, located in the Belgian Ardennes countryside on the eastern side of Belgium. It's grey, a little bit misty as well, and this is expected to ebb and flow throughout the weekend too. But at the moment, it looks like it has slightly dried up compared to the start of the day. So let's see what happens and what unfolds. In practice one, guiding you through all the coverage is myself, Harry Benjamin, and alongside me is the former McLaren F1 team mechanic, Mark Priestley. Nice to have you here, Mark. And it's weird because Spa is usually the first race back after the summer break, but now it's very much end of term at school vibes.
It is a bit like that. It's totally thrown everybody, I think. Yeah, Hungary's normally the last one, then Belgium the first one, but it's different this time around. The weather's pretty much the same though, unpredictable. As you said, it's in the middle of an Ardennes forest, a very hilly section of Belgium, which means it has its own little sort of microclimate. It can change from being bright sunshine to wet very quickly, and equally it means that you can have a very wet part of the track, and yet on the other side of the track can be completely dry, and that can pose a number of really interesting and quite exciting potentially challenges for the teams.
Yeah, Spa has been the scene of many an exciting qualifying and race over the years. It's one of the most historic races on the calendar. As you say though, it is hilly, and we are on a little bit of a bowl here, surrounded by the hills and the trees that run the course of this just over 7 kilometre track, and so the low cloud cover is slightly infringing on the visibility. The umbrellas and the waterproof clothing, the Pacamax, are all out in full force, so the grandstands are packed already. People are mounting the hillside here, and it's only practice one, but because it's a sprint, we get straight into the weekend because it's only one practice before we're straight into business.
Yeah, it's actually a great example of what we were just talking about. 5 minutes ago, we just said amongst ourselves, it actually looks like it might be drying up a bit. Now the umbrellas are back up in the air and it is pouring down with rain along the start-finish straight. Very steep hill down towards Eau Rouge and Radion, and then up the hill onto that long famous Kemmel Straight. Some wonderful parts of this racetrack which should provide some fantastic racing. And if the weather is changeable, I don't mind that. I think that's great from a spectator point of view, from a fan's point of view. That's kind of what you want, right?
Oh, it absolutely is. And okay, I take everything back that I said earlier that it was drying. We've just seen a camera angle where it's literally completely pouring it down with rain. So I take it all back. No one's in a massive rush to get in their car. Session hasn't actually started yet. I'll get going in a couple of minutes' time. Let's just take you through with how the Drivers' Championship looks ahead of the weekend. It'll come to no shock that Max Verstappen is currently leading the championship with 281 points. He has a gap of 110 over his teammate Sergio Perez, who was back onto the podium in Hungary. In second with 171 points. Third then is Alonso, 32 points back from Perez. Then it's Hamilton, Russell, the top 5, Sainz, Leclerc, Norris, and an improved McLaren form beginning to rocket up the order. He's now into 8th ahead of Stroll, and Esteban Ocon rounds out the top 10 in the driver standings. Over in the teams, and it's a similar story. Red Bull currently leading and will maintain that, I'm sure. 452 points is how many points they have. That's a 229 gap to second place Mercedes. Then comes Aston Martin, Ferrari, McLaren, the top 5, Alpine, Williams, Haas, Alfa Romeo and Alfa Tauri 10th and last, but everyone with points on the board. And Mark, it is this battle at the moment for second. Who's got the second fastest car, the second fastest team? Because we all know that barring any issues, and it seems any kind of reliability or tech issues never seem to affect Max Verstappen, he will win the race. But it's behind him where the action is. McLaren rocketing up over the last couple of races with the upgrades they've brought. Aston Martin started the year so well, now dipping behind. Where does that leave Ferrari? Mercedes? Never rule out Alpine. You can't call it.
I mean, if you took Max Verstappen and Red Bull out of this championship, it's one of the best years we've had, isn't it? Because it is ebbing and flowing. The performance is shifting between one team and another at different parts of the season, and that's kind of exactly what you want. Of course, Red Bull are dominating, and I suspect at a circuit like this, which is very much about high speed, high power, very fast, long straights, we know that they are all the strengths of that Red Bull team, and so they will, I'm sure, barring any disasters, dominate here. But you're right, behind them it is shifting, and McLaren are perhaps the team in form out of that group you just mentioned right now. They brought big upgrades to Silverstone, and over the last couple of races we've really seen that performance take a giant leap, and that means you've got to say after the last couple of rounds they're probably the second fastest team right now.
They are going into this weekend full of confidence. The track action has started, so I'll just do a little sync up for those who wish to do so. 59 minutes and 22, 21 and 20 seconds remain of this free practice one session, and we do have a car on track. It is the Williams of Alex Albon, who's tentatively made his way to the end of the Kemmel Straight through Lecombe, and now just coming through the right-hander of Malmedy and approaching Beau Rivage, where it starts to go downhill. And actually, Williams are quite confident, I think, ahead of this weekend because of their straight line speed. And around here, you have the Kemmel Straight, fast corners as well. This could really favour a Williams team. Albon has already shown what he can get out of that car, and maybe even Logan Sargent, a rookie American alongside him, could even possibly look at his first points of the year here.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's absolutely right. I think we've actually all been a little bit surprised in a positive way of what Albon particularly has been able to get out of that car. At races like Hungary, which couldn't be more different to this. It's slow, it's tight, it's twisty, it's high downforce, whereas this one, like you said, it's all about that high speed. And yes, there's some very fast corners where you do need to rely on some aerodynamic grip and alongside mechanical to keep the car planted to the floor, but it's generally about high speed. And if you haven't got that slippery, low drag type setup, and Williams have got that, if you haven't got that, you're going to struggle around here. So I think this is probably one of their best opportunities of these few races that we've been in recently.
Absolutely. Well, Williams, of course, with some decent recent history here as well. Of course, the front row in 2021 with George Russell, an amazing qualifying lap from him. Of course, the race was a different story. It was technically his first podium before all the confusion about did we have a race or did we not. So Williams here looking very good, and Alex Albon as well was fifth on debut here when he was for Red Bull at Spa. So loves this track. Right now, Lewis Hamilton, we just heard the sound of the seven-time world champion and making his way up through Eau Rouge onto Radion. He's now in the second part of the sector of this circuit, heading downhill and approaching the double left-hander with Pouon as the rain continues to fly down.
Yeah, huge amounts of rain. The drivers all on full wet tyres here, and you might sort of wonder, well, why are they going out if it's this bad? But we don't know what the weather's going to do over the rest of the weekend. It's very unpredictable, but there is a very high chance we're definitely going to see more rain at some point. So this running that they're getting right now, albeit in terrible conditions, is still useful. It's about understanding what your car's doing in these conditions, how these tyres are performing in these temperatures and around this type of very wet track. Actually, Alex Albon on the intermediate tyres, not the full wets. But yeah, huge plumes of spray off the back. It's really a sort of fact-finding mission right now, just finding where the water lies, where the wet patches are going to be, where it's going to dry out quicker, how the curbs react in these kind of conditions too. So it's all useful information.
Yeah, only 10 drivers out on track at the moment. The two Williamses, the two Mercedes, the two Alfa Tauris, the two Alfa Romeos, and the two Hasses as well. Everybody on wets except for the two Hasses and the two Williams. They are on intermediates. This is the sound of Lewis Hamilton, who's making his way through the bus stop chicane, round the left-hander at the final corner as he tries to apply the throttle. It's very tentative. Should we just have a listen and see where he brakes for turn one?
Very early. Very early, yeah. So in turn one here is one of those corners where slightly rises up towards the apex, but then you come down this very long and steep hill, down past the old start-finish, the old pits, come down into Eau Rouge, through Radion and up the hill. It's a very, very high speed where you need to lean on the car's downforce and trust the car's going to grip. We've seen the scene of many accidents, some of them tragically sad in recent times as well. Let's hope we have none of that this weekend, of course. But this is a really fast, really exciting, enthralling part of the lap, but the drivers really need to have complete trust and faith that their car is going to do what they think it's going to do when they're going through there at such high speed.
But a lot of talk as well has been, in these kind of conditions, the visibility behind the cars. And Lewis Hamilton makes his way downhill now through Beau Rivage and approaching the double left-hander of Fouon. When, especially in a straight line, the amount of spray that gets kicked up off the rear wheels, angles up through the rear wing. If you're in a pack, that is bordering on dangerous.
Absolutely. I mean, the best way to equate it to anybody at home is like if you're driving in really thick fog, like the thickest fog you've ever driven in, where you in your road car would be almost basically coming to a stop because you'd see it as being so unsafe that you can't really proceed. You know what's going to be there.
And we have heavier rain in the pit lane.
Okay, that's Bono talking to Lewis Hamilton, just giving him a weather update. But the spray is so bad that you rightly say you can't see anything. You're going into what looks like a wall of fog if you're the car behind, and yet you can't really afford to back off because, of course, your lap time's ruined. If it's a qualifying lap, it's game over. And so you have this situation which is inherently dangerous, but you're required to go into it if you want to set the lap time. And so Formula One have been looking at some technical options as to how they might be able to reduce this, and the only way I can describe them is having mud guards on the back of the car.
But they did test those, didn't they? But I don't think they were particularly happy with the results of it either. So there isn't a solution, tomorrow on
well, they'll
the cards,
keep developing that. They've got more tests planned with that, and they will keep working on it. I mean, these are the best engineers in the world, and it might sound pretty low tech, hanging a mudguard off the back of the car. But if that solution can be found or can be made to work, a bit like the Halo, it may be not everyone's favourite design and aesthetic feature, but if it does an important job, we'll very quickly get used to it if they are introduced.
It is funny that. I remember the Halo being introduced, and even I looked at it, you just go, how can you possibly get used to that being on top of a car and sort of obscuring you seeing the driver as George Russell comes to the end of the Kemmel Straight and gets a little bit of a wiggle on the rear end, but manages to sling it into the right hand of Lecombe. And Lewis Hamilton also out there in his Mercedes still. The fastest lap time is Alex Albon at the moment. This is the sound of the Thai driver. It's a 2:08.3 at the moment, and this is him braking and locking up and going straight on down at the bus stop chicane. Just can't get it stopped in time, but there's enough runoff there that you can sling it back around. Although there is a gravel trap there as well, so you can't go too deep.
Yeah, he just about managed to avoid that. But it's in these conditions, as soon as you lock the tyres, you're a passenger. You are like you're in a boat. You've got no way of stopping it. It just glides across the shiny, wet tarmac, and you're on your way to somewhere you didn't intend to be. But it's very difficult conditions. I've got to say, actually, we just did a slow-mo shot of the Williams going through, or was Lewis Hamilton rather, going through with the wet spray coming off the cars. The engineers, particularly the aerodynamicists, love these kind of conditions because it's almost like you get to see the flow structures coming off various parts of the car that you'd never normally get to see on your rivals' cars unless you're in their wind tunnel. And yet with the spray, you get to see these vortices being spun up through the floor and off the front wing. And they will, you make no mistake, they'll be taking very detailed pictures, they'll be studying those slow-mos, and they'll be looking at exactly how other cars perform and compare those to theirs.
Well, we mentioned the visibility. George Russell likened the visibility of driving behind an F1 car to driving down the motorway and your wipers stop working. So that's exactly what George Russell said. Yeah. So that gives you more of an idea of some of the difficulties that the drivers experience when in the wet. Out on track at the moment is Daniel Ricciardo in the AlphaTauri, his second race back. And Mark, the last time you were with me in the commentary box, we were just saying it was Spain, wasn't it? So it was still Nick De Vries territory then. It's now Daniel Ricciardo back behind the wheel. So actually, what are your first thoughts about Ricciardo coming back into the fold?
Mixed in that, very excited to see him back behind the wheel of an F1 car because I feel like that's where he should be. I think he's an exciting driver, he's a character, and the sport needs all of that. I felt sad for Nick De Vries. I'm not sure he was given enough time. Yes, he didn't perform well enough, but was he given the right conditions in which the environment in which he was able to thrive? Should he have been given a bit more time? These are all open-ended questions, but very tough for him. Having said that, I thought Daniel Ricciardo did a really strong, solid job on a weekend when he'd never driven that car up until the actual race weekend got going. What we should see this time out here in Belgium is a Daniel Ricciardo who's much more familiar with his new surroundings, much more familiar with his car, with his engineer, with his mechanics. Everything will feel a little bit more natural, and that should all just incrementally start helping him to get to the performance that he needs to be at.
Yeah, well, he's just tentatively made his way back into the pit lane, because especially in these conditions, it's quite tight coming into the pit lane entry, because it's surrounded by a wall either side and quite a narrow entry. Instead of going left through the latter half of the bus stop chicane, you keep to the right and slingshot it in to the pit lane that way. But Daniel Ricciardo clearly had enough. He's seen what he's seen in these conditions and gets wheeled back into the carriage. And we're just seeing some very funny shots with Christian Horner talking to some VIPs in the Red Bull garage, and one of them is wearing a Ferrari cap, so he's brought over some black sticky tape to try and cover that up. Fantastic.
Right on brand.
But despite the weather, everybody is still out in full force. So the banks that surround the Spa-Francorchamps circuit and the grandstands are getting fuller and fuller. We've got some Ferrari and Italian flags out there as well, waving the flag for the prancing horse, hoping they can get back into the fight a little bit more. We talked about this fight for second. Ferrari, Mercedes, McLaren now increasingly, they seem to be the team to beat in Formula 1.5 at least. But with Ferrari, there was a little bit of news coming into this weekend as well. Lauren Mekies, sporting director, who we know is going to AlphaTauri as a team principal next year, as we just heard the sounds of the AlphaTauri, of Danny Ricciardo having a little bit of a moment at the top of Eau Rouge and into Radion. Had to run wide, but managed to keep it back on track and into a straight line. So that would have given him a little bit of a heart flutter, I'm sure. But Lauren Mekies out after Spa. That has now been confirmed. So Ferrari happy to release him. Replaced by Diego Ioverno. And it's another change of structure. Well, it's not a change of structure, because Diego's been with the team for quite a long time. But is that a good thing then? Because it kind of maintains familiarity within the top managerial structure of Ferrari?
It depends how you look at it, doesn't it? Because yes, it does. So familiarity and consistency, that's great if you're doing well. But Ferrari haven't really been successful, I guess you could say, for a long period of time now. They are one of the teams that have had the biggest budget before we started this budget capped era. They've had the best facilities, they've got huge numbers of people, they've got everything you need in place to create a successful Formula 1 team, and yet they haven't really managed to do that. They haven't had championship success for many years. I mean, Kimi Raikkonen, the last driver to win a championship back in 2007 for Ferrari, that's a long period of time. So on that basis, is that a good thing, or is change what's required? My view on this is that I think Ferrari, with the new team principal in Fred Vasseur, I think that's a really strong appointment. We've got to give him some time. It is going to take some time for him to put his mark on this place and stamp his authority, understand what's either been going wrong, what's been going right, what he needs to tweak, which people he needs to move around. That's a process that definitely is going to take time, and I think we've got to give him that, that respect to have that time. So I don't want to make too many judgments on Ferrari. I'm disappointed with Ferrari. I'm continually disappointed with Ferrari with the way that their results are, given everything I've just said. But I'm also hopeful about their future, and I think Fred is a really good starting point. So maybe this change at the top is just a part of the next phase of the rebuilding under Fred Vasseur.
Quite possibly. I think as Sebastian Vettel once said, everybody is a Ferrari fan, so we all want to see them back up at the front and fighting. In fact, they are tied with the McLaren for the most amount of pole positions around Spa. And how's this for a stat? Ferrari have won the last 3 Grand Prix scheduled on the 30th of July. So who knows? If you want to cling on to that,
that is a great
could well happen. Verstappen, Hungary 2017. Not Verstappen, Vettel, Hungary. Schumacher, Germany 2006, and Barrichello, Germany 2000.
But if those are the kind of stats Ferrari are clinging on to, that is desperate, isn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, I agree. I think we all want to see Ferrari back in the mix, back in the hunt. They should be. The sport is better off when they are up there, and I firmly believe they will be. We're seeing it already. Formula One's cyclic, isn't it? We've seen a Mercedes era. We're now seeing a Red Bull racing era. But Mercedes are on their way back. McLaren are now starting to edge their way back towards the front as well. We've got Aston Martin showing signs of progress, even though that's disappeared temporarily. So these things go in phases, and Ferrari will have their phase again, and I feel like we're at the beginning of that next phase of potential Ferrari success.
Well, hashtag BBCF1, Chris has asked you, Mark, how proud of McLaren are you right now?
Oh, so proud. I mean, genuinely, and I say that not just through watching the races, but through talking to many of my friends that are still there, the feeling going through McLaren right now is incredible. I was actually at the Goodwood Festival of Speed here in the UK a couple of weeks ago with McLaren, with many of my old colleagues, some of the old cars. I was reunited with...
Did they get you back working, did they?
No, I was there doing some TV stuff, but I was there, got reunited with the car that we won the championship with Lewis in 2008. And the thing I took away from it was that there's a real sense of buoyant mood around the place. Everybody's got smiles, they're beaming, they're sort of full of optimism. And I think if you went back 3-4 years, you wouldn't have had that. People were a bit down at that point, and the results reflected that. But it just takes one good result, and we've had a few of them now at McLaren, and it gives you the whole team, not just the driver, not just the people on the pit wall, gives the whole team a boost in confidence, and you carry that forward and you start to puff your chest out a little bit, and you start to just up your game by small amounts. And that's how you build success. McLaren are very much on that path right now.
Well, Lando Norris, first back-to-back podiums for a McLaren driver since Lewis Hamilton.
There you go.
So that just emphasises, and that was back in 2012, so emphasises how far they've come. Oscar Piastri, on the other side, also showing an upturn in results. Not quite on the pace of Lando Norris, but it's almost to be expected in a way. Norris is so embedded into that team, has way more experience. But surely a maiden podium is just around the corner.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm a bit impressed with Oscar Piastri. I think, for someone in his rookie year, a new team, I don't think we can expect him to necessarily be right on the pace of Lando. Exactly as you say, Lando's a hot property in Formula One right now. There's even people talking about Lando going to some of the big teams in the future. Who knows what his future holds? But when people start talking about a driver in that regard, you know they're a big ticket. And so for Oscar to be at least close, the third and fourth places they had recently, the result last time out in Budapest was strong from both drivers, and that's really the key to this. That's why the team are feeling so good. It's not just one driver, this is both drivers showing a real upturn in form, and that will only continue to build.
If you want another terrible stats, I don't know why this weekend I've got more than usual, but McLaren's first F1 win as a constructor came in Spa 1968, when Bruce McLaren led only the final lap of the race. He was 22 years old. How old is Oscar Piastri? He's 22 years old.
There you go.
Have that one. You can have that one for free. Here's what's happening out on track at the moment. 42 minutes and 53 seconds on the clock, and we have got a few who are braving it out there. Carlos Sainz in the Ferrari is just entering sector 1 now. Lando Norris in the McLaren has just come out of the pit lane, and this is the sound of the McLaren, who's done a practice start at the end and gets going. And even as we ride on board, but we're looking back at Lando's helmet, brilliant view. You can just see what we've been talking about, the spray and the vortices that kick up from either side of the car and then almost congregate together and rise above the rear wing, and away he goes. And I'm sure there'll be a few tear-offs from the visor having to come with the amount of rain that gets poured onto these things.
You mentioned driving without windscreen wipers. That's effectively what they're doing with their visor, isn't it? And so the way they overcome that is a couple of things. A, the aerodynamics of the car do tend to move the water up and around the driver's head for aerodynamic gain, but also, of course, their visor's being peppered with spray, so they coat it with a liquid coating which just allows the water to bead off. But also have the visor tear-offs, like you say, multiple tear-offs that are placed on their crash helmet pre-session by the driver's trainer typically. So they will have sometimes 8, 9 or 10 visor tear-offs that they could just rip off, throw away, and give them a sort of almost like a fresh, clean windscreen, if you like, to look through. But even with all of those measures, it's still very difficult. And we just saw Lando literally taking his gloved hand to wipe his visor. So there is no absolute way of keeping the visibility absolutely clear in these conditions.
This is the sound of Carlos Sainz in the Ferrari approaching the final couple of corners through the left-hander. You normally take that flat if you dare, not in these conditions, and then you're straight into the braking zone, coming through Blanchimont into the bus stop chicane. Clouts a little bit of the inside curve, unsettles the car, bounces a little bit, but then finds a bit of traction on the full wet tyres, and then we lose the Ferrari into a plume of spray as he appears once more and slows right down as he crosses the line before he makes his way into the right-hander of La Source. Sainz going second fastest there. They're all on the wets, everybody set a time, bar Alex Albon on the intermediate, who is fastest with a 2:08.394, but he set that quite early on and has come into the pits. We should say, which we haven't done, because it's so easy to almost not talk about Max Verstappen in a way, because he's so out and away in his own league. But he does actually have a 5-place grid penalty coming his way for going over his gearbox allocation. Yeah. But let's remember that he started 14th, I think, here last year and carved his way through the field in what was a grid penalty galore race. So I can't imagine. It's not going to be another pole. Well, he could well get pole, but then he'll be demoted. But it's going to be at least a different front row to what we've experienced so far this year. Yeah,
and also bear in mind that they haven't taken this because their gearbox is broken, they've had to fit a new one. They've taken this strategically because they know they're almost certainly going to need more than the 4 gearboxes that you're allowed from a season. They're going to need more than that because they did have a niggle with the gearbox earlier in the season. So they're going to get through more than the allocation. They've chosen this race to take the extra one because it's a very easy place to overtake. This is a circuit that's going to absolutely suit the strengths and the characteristics of their car. So it's a strategic grid penalty. I mean, you know that when you've got that much pace in hand, you can afford to take it almost anywhere, but this is one of their best opportunities, because if he starts 6th, in fact, to be honest, wherever he starts, as you said, he started 14th last year and relatively easily won the race. This year he's got an even more dominant car, so a 5-place grid penalty here is almost irrelevant to some extent.
In a world of Formula One where the calendar is forever increasing, we're expanding into new territories, we're getting more temporary street circuits. At a track like this, which, as we just said, you can get some good overtaking as Sergio Perez gets onto the curb and kicks out the rear a little bit now as he approaches Blanchimont. But is there still a place for Spa on the calendar in your mind? Because I think for a lot of people, it's falling more and more out of favour.
The trouble Formula One have got is it's becoming more and more of an entertainment business, because the people that bought into the sport, rightly so, have had to grow the sport. They want to get the money back that they invested in it, so it has to grow their revenues, and to do that, it's got to become an even bigger entertainment spectacle. And as a result of that, they want to go to more destination events. They want to go to Miami, they want to go to Vegas. These are typically city centre races where there's a lot more than just the Grand Prix for people to want to fly into that city, boost the local economy and come for the whole weekend. Spa's not one of those, but what Spa is one of the best racetracks in the world, hands down. And so for me, Formula One, which is the best category in my mind of racing anywhere, has to keep tracks like Spa. Yes, we can mix it with the likes of Vegas and Miami and etc., but we've got to keep some of these traditional tracks. Suzuka, Silverstone, Spa, they cannot afford to go, in my opinion.
I'm inclined to agree. It would just feel a little bit wrong not having it on the calendar, something so steeped in history. And I know times move on as we have a yellow flag out for Pierre Gasly, who has gone straight on. I think that's at the bus stop chicane, and is now doing a nice reverse number before he rejoins the track. So yellow flag out in sector 3 at the moment, but no harm done for Pierre Gasly, and he goes straight back into the pit lane, and we're just going to see how that happened. I imagine he locks up the fronts.
Yeah, exactly that. Very, very steep climb there, and very, very fast into a big braking zone, and just lock the left front in exactly the same way that we saw somebody else do a moment ago. And as I said earlier, you're a passenger at that point. As soon as the front tyres have locked, you've got no steering, you get no braking, you really can't do anything, and you just have to start cadence braking, where you just almost pump the brake pedal on and off until you get some bite and hope you haven't hit the wall by that point.
Well, luckily didn't. Gasly makes it back into the pits, and the team begin to work on that car and wheel it back into the garage. And actually, Alpine are in desperate need of a clean weekend off the back of a double DNF where both of them were out in turn 1. Wasn't either of their fault. They were a victim of Zhou Guanyu going into the back of Daniel Ricciardo, and then that was the pinball effect for the two Alpines. And Silverstone wasn't great for them either, especially when you look at the other teams around them. McLaren have leapfrogged them quite dramatically in this big fight for second, really, that Alpine are now right at the bottom of. it's crunch time for Alpine.
It really is. I think you're right. They've had a lot of bad luck. You know, a few of those incidents you mentioned there was nothing they could have necessarily done about them. However, if you just take performance of their car, it's not been good enough consistently. When you look at the likes of McLaren who've taken this big step, and others, I guess fortunately to some extent for them, the likes of Aston Martin, who seem to have dropped back, are a slight buffer. So there's another team that was ahead of them that have dropped back into their mix, but Alpine need to up their game, and I think at the moment they're struggling to do that. It's a difficult season in that regard, given we've got this cost cap which is now in its second full year. It's difficult to just spend your way out of trouble. You can't do it necessarily like you used to be able to in the olden days. And so you've got to be very clever, strategic about the direction you go, and then when you schedule your upgrades. And if what you've scheduled to bring in hasn't worked in the way you thought, you're kind of on the back foot for what can be a really long period into the season to follow.
Well, exactly that. And they brought some upgrades this weekend, new floor off the back of a front wing in Hungary. So hoping that that's going to find us a pace before we then go into the summer break. Of course, you have the mandatory summer shutdown where you cannot do any work. Are you literally barred from going into the factory? That's
right, yeah. They sort of shut the factory
security
doors.
on the door.
Well, there are some people allowed in. You're allowed to do things like maintenance in your factory, but certainly any of the engineering functions, the design functions, anything to do with car and car performance is literally not allowed in the factory. So it's very strictly policed.
Wow, well, that's So, but who polices it, though?
Well, it's self-policed.
Okay.
However, you have to send in a log of things like hours and who's been in and who's been out, who hasn't. And it's one of those things that it's not worth trying to cheat it, because if somebody got found out of going in to do some work, you can imagine the punishment would be incredibly severe.
I wouldn't want to risk it, that's for sure. Still raining in Spa. Oscar Piastri, and it's the two McLarens fastest at the moment. 2:03.7 for Piastri. Then Norris. Then the two McLarens are actually on the intermediate tyre as well. Then it's Leclerc, Perez, Albon, Tsunoda, Sainz, Ricciardo, Hülkenberg in the Haas follows that. Then it's Alonso the top 10, Hamilton and Russell and Zhou Guanyu, the 13 drivers who have set representative lap times. Sargent, Bottas, Magnussen, Stroll have all been around a few times, as has Gasly, Ocon, and Max Verstappen, curiously, has only been out for one lap, and he is not even in his car. He is at the back of the garage having a little look at one of the side tables with an engineer overlooking his shoulder as a bit of work goes on, and one of the mechanics looks inside of the cockpit. His teammate Sergio Perez has just pulled up outside into the pit box and has now been put up on the jacks and will be wheeled back in. So Verstappen not in any hurry to get out there and maybe risk anything in these conditions.
Very relaxed, isn't he? One thing we haven't said yet, which came out just earlier on today, in fact, our chief F1 writer Andrew Benson, I think, broke the story, that the FIA and the teams have agreed between themselves that this session won't set the grid if qualifying later on today is cancelled because of weather. So in the regulations, that is what happens. If we can't do qualifying today, the regulations say that you would take the times from the one and only practice session, i.e. this one, to set the grid. But because the conditions here right now are so bad, the teams and the FIA agreed between them that it's so dangerous and so unpredictable, and given that they would then go into qualifying or into the race rather with no practice, no track time, then they wouldn't do it that way.
Possibly rain increasing around turn 5s to 8.
What they haven't done yet is announce how they would set that grid, so that's still to be decided if indeed qualifying was cancelled for some reason later on.
Pick a number out of the hat and go with that.
That'd be great, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's how good. There's your new format, FIA. You have to wonder though as well, because we only have one practice session when it's a sprint weekend, because we're straight into Grand Prix qualifying this afternoon. If it was the 3 practice sessions, and we do expect the weather to get a little bit better. I don't think it's going to completely dry up for the rest of the weekend, but we do expect it to get a little bit better. I would have imagined actually we would have barely any action in this 3 practice one compared to what we've actually had. There has been a fair amount of action. I think the most amount of laps comes from Yuki Tsunoda's done 8 out there. Everyone's around 7, 6, 5 after that. So they have been going around as Carlos Sainz and the Ferrari crew practice a pit stop, and it all looks fairly clean there. And we did have a yellow flag momentarily, and it is because Zhou Guanyu in the Alfa Romeo slightly altered livery. There's a few green flicks to celebrate one of their sponsors, but he is now on the grass and heading downhill. It's almost rally-esque as he locks up the tyres, he brakes and slides down the grass and rejoins the track. And where is that coming on to? Is that the Kemmel Straight, it almost looks like?
Albon off as well.
Albon, so the rain getting heavier and heavier, so Albon is coming down towards Beau Rivage, so it's coming through Lecombe for Albon. I think he went probably straight on and rejoined. So Zhou off, Albon off, one Alfa Romeo and one Williams off. As the weather continues to ramp up, it is grey. The cloud cover is lowering here in this bowl in the Ardennes forest in Belgium. We're just getting a look at how Zhou Guanyu found the grass, and it was coming through Beau Rivage and straight into the gravel, and he does make contact with the barrier. This is the sound of it. Doesn't get it slowed down in time. Into the gravel, and a little nick of the front left onto the barrier there. Lucky actually not to clout it with any more vigour.
Yeah, I think he'll get away with it just. And Albon pretty much similar, different part of the track, but similar, just zero grip at the point where he wanted to turn in, and the car just understeers out towards the outside of the circuit, and he finds himself off track.
As does the other Williams in the exact same spot that Albon went off, but he has stopped, and that has brought out a red flag. So Sargent then, has he had any bigger incident? The car has come to a full stop. Doesn't appear to be any major damage, but he's clearly had a jaunt through the grass because the floor is drenched in grass and mud that he's picked off. Let's hear what he has to say.
You okay?
Yeah, I couldn't turn. Something broke, man.
Understood.
So there is a bit of damage there on the front left.
He's gone through one of the Pirelli barriers. We're getting a replay now, so let's talk you through it. And he's flat out down this point along the straight, gets to the braking point very early, locks the front tyres, slides straight on and kisses the big Pirelli barrier that's just lining the tyre wall, destroys the left-hand side of his front wing, and the car comes to a stop. So I'm not sure something broke. I think he just locked up the brakes like everyone else.
And I think, well, I was going to say the ones who've been off are on intermediate. So the Zhou was on an intermediate, yes. So perhaps it is getting heavier, and the intermediate tyre just doesn't have the grooves big enough to displace the water, and you're at the plane off. Simple as. The crane is out to get Sargent's Williams, and Logan is out of the car. The American rookie yet to score points in Formula One. He's only ahead in the championship of Nick De Vries, who is now not in Formula One, and his replacement Daniel Ricciardo behind him, with the 21 drivers that make up the Drivers' Championship. So,
well, in that regard, he cannot finish last now, can he?
Well, absolutely correct.
So we're not scoring all points.
So that's one saving grace. But that, an incident like this at a track that Logan knows as well. He won the F3 sprint race here in 2020. As we get to more European tracks, when you've got the other car performing in the very capable hands of Alex Albon as well, the pressure, we talked about pressure on Nick De Vries, and that kind of, I think, let Logan Sargent go a little bit under the radar, perhaps. Yeah. Now, though, surely pressure's ramping up on Sargent.
Yeah, it is. It will be. I guess Williams, you'd say, is a slightly more forgiving place than as part of that Red Bull family, perhaps, so he might get a little bit more time. And I think there's probably some differences in the way that his career is being funded, let's say, in that he maybe brings some money to the team, which is valuable, whereas Nick De Vries, I'm sure, wasn't necessarily in the same regard. So, look, I think it's difficult. He is struggling, and Albon's doing a very, very good job, which just makes it harder. That's always where pressure comes in. It's when your teammate's doing a better job than you, because that's what highlights the strengths and weaknesses of you versus your car. We're seeing it at the very front end with Sergio Perez versus Max Verstappen. Max is showing us what that Red Bull car is capable of, yet Sergio not able to deliver that week in, week out, and the same thing's happening at Williams there. So I think that's testament to Albon. I don't think it's all about Logan not doing the good enough job. I think there's part of that, but I also think there's part of it that Alex Albon is doing a really good job.
Yeah, Albon having a bit of a revitalised career, I think, at Williams since coming back with them after being shown the door at Red Bull, but still being supported by Red Bull. I think there's even talks they were trying to get him back into an AlphaTauri, maybe into a Red Bull. Vicious rumours in Formula One.
It's that time of year, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it is getting... I'm actually surprised it hasn't ramped up a little bit more. There's all talk, Lewis Hamilton even still hasn't signed this Mercedes contract. We were told, yeah, the deal's done practically, but then it's all got a bit quiet now. So
yeah, it's interesting that, isn't it? I mean, I still firmly believe Lewis will sign another contract, probably a 2-year deal, I suspect, and it will probably, again speculation, but probably be his last. But I don't think he wants to bow out at this point. I think he's a central part of the Mercedes kind of fight back. Make no mistake, they are learning so much at Mercedes after so many years of dominance. The last couple of years have been a struggle, but they've been learning massive amounts and working hard behind the scenes. Just now starting to see signs on occasion, not consistently enough, where they're edging back towards being competitive. We saw a pole position from Lewis last week. I think he's got a lot more to show this sport. I don't think he's done, and I think he can still offer a lot to Mercedes and to Formula One.
Yeah, 104th pole position last time out in Hungary, and it's actually 10 years to the day since his first Mercedes win in Hungary in 2013. And although he's a 4-time winner around Spa, Lewis Hamilton, he's actually failed to finish in Spa 5 times, which is the most out of any track that he has been to. So clearly stats mean absolutely nothing in Formula One. So don't listen to me. But we're under a red flag condition at the moment. 24 minutes and 41 seconds remain, but the clock does of course continue to count down in practice. If this was a competitive session, then the clock would stop and we would get a restart time, but everyone then back into the pits, eagle-eyed, looking out of the gap in their visor, with a bit of work being done on Oscar Piastri's front end in the McLaren as they try and get back out on track for the remainder of this session when we do. But Logan Sargent's Williams still being cleared, I believe.
And just to go back to that conversation we're having about should qualifying be cancelled because of weather later on, how do you set the grid? I guess the two obvious solutions are either you make the shootout, the sprint shootout tomorrow morning, set the grid for both, or you go back to the old way of doing it, which was have the sprint race set the grid for the main race. So there are options that could work.
Talk of formats, last time out in Hungary we had the alternative tyre allocation. So everybody had to use, in qualifying in Q1, the hard compounded tyre. In Q2 they had to use the medium compounded tyre, and in Q3 everyone had to use the soft compounded tyre. And I liked it, but I don't know if I've seen enough to know how good it was, because although it resulted in some pretty spectacular results, you had Zhou Guanyu up in 5th, Hamilton taking pole, the top 10 is the closest top 10 ever in Formula One, half a tenth between P1 and P10 Nico Hülkenberg. All that on paper is great, but was that I don't believe that was a result of, at least entirely, of this slightly altered tyre allocation.
No, I agree with you. I think, Hungary, very, very short lap, so it was always going to be much closer anyway. It's one of the shortest circuits on the calendar. In fact, it is, bar Monaco. So you always get a much less of a gap over the spread of the field. So I think, yes, we need a larger data sample set to get a better idea of it. But the downside of it was that I think we saw less action in the early part of the weekend because people didn't have enough tyres or enough allocation of tyres to just go and do whatever they wanted. And I wonder what the trade-off there is, because Formula One needs cars on track, because that is the sport, that's what the fans come to see. And even if it's a practice session, we want to see cars out there. And yet I guess there was a feeling that maybe they didn't have enough tyres. So maybe there's tweaks that we could make to it, and that's what this experimental process is all about. And I've got to take my hat off to Formula One and say that's great. We're trying these things, we're going to learn about it, and maybe we tweak it next time and we go again. It's a bit like the sprint. You may not like the sprint, but we're experimenting with it, we're tweaking it, we're trying it, and we're gradually learning every time we do it, and it may end up being a format that works in the end.
Absolutely, that's sort of the good thing the Formula One is doing. At least we're not being afraid to try things out. And if they fail, okay, they fail, we'll retweak it and try something else. We've had a few tweets come in on hashtag BBC F1 asking, what happens if the race is shortened or whatever, because of course it was Spa 2021 where it was all the confusion. This was introduced following Spa 2021. This is what happens. No points are awarded unless a minimum of 2 laps have been completed under green flag conditions. If more than 2 laps are completed, but less than 20% of the race distance, points are awarded on a 6, 4, 3, 2, 1 basis to the top 5. If we get to 25% to 50% of the race distance completed, which will be from lap 11 on Sunday, points will be awarded 13 points down to 1 point to the top 9. 50% to 75% of the race distance completed, that will be after lap 22. Points will be awarded 19, 14, 12, all the way down to 1 to the top 10. And if we get more than 75% of the race distance, and that will be after lap 33, we will get full points awarded.
That is way too complicated.
You got that? I'll do it one more time for you.
I mean, why does it have to be that complicated? I mean, I get we needed tweaks after the sort of debacle that we had here the other year, but the bit you said, the first line you said, 2 green flag laps.
Should just left it at that, yeah.
Stop there, exactly.
But then people want to know how many points do they get?
But just give full points. I mean, we always had this rule that I think it was 75%. If it doesn't make 75%, you get half points. Other than that, it's a full race. I mean, what's wrong with that?
Well, we also that was introduced, and then we had the carnage of Japan, of course, last year. Did Max Verstappen win it? Did he not? Because, of course, I think it's almost spelled out for you in such lengthy detail, perhaps a little bit because the wording for Japan, where the race was stopped, but there was no explicit wording of, okay, but then if the same race is restarted, all of what I just said no longer applies, and we will get full points. Yeah. So they've now tweaked that, but I think everyone knew what they meant when they wrote those, but it clearly wasn't just set out in detail.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things. I think Formula One is such a complex sport on so many levels that wherever we can simplify it, and if you think about, as we touched on earlier, they're growing the sport, it's becoming a bigger entertainment business. We've got new fans coming in after watching the Netflix documentary Drive to Survive. They're rookies to this sport. They don't know the ins and outs of it. You present them with what you've just said, it'll blow their minds.
Well, there you go. We've got it out of the way now. So if you missed it, rewind. Red flags come in now. So Logan Sargent's car has been collected. Sargent no longer taking part in the session. He had a pretty long walk ahead of him as he trotted back to the pit lane. The rain still pummeling down hard here in Spa with 18 minutes and 52 seconds remaining on the clock. Nobody is out on the track. Everybody taking their sweet time at the moment. Hashtag BBC F1, we were talking about Spa and the dangers perhaps it might drop off the calendar. Chris has said you can't remove the giants of F1: Silverstone, Montreal, Monza, Spa, Suzuka. Sure, money talks, but then we'd have 20 races in the Middle East or in street track circuits that aren't producing good enough racing.
I'm with you, Chris.
We've also there was another one I saw as well, but it's disappeared now. So,
I think the key here is a mix. I'm absolutely up for bringing Vegas in. I think it's going to be a spectacular event, but let's pair it with the likes of Spa. Let's have a mixture of events that all give different entertainment spectacles, different challenges to the drivers. Some cars, the cars that are quick here in Belgium, are not necessarily going to be the cars that are quick. Take Max Verstappen out of the picture. Not necessarily the ones going to be quick in Vegas. I don't mind having that. I like having complete opposite ends of the extreme spectrums of types of racetrack. Variety is literally the spice of life.
It certainly is. Sorry, Jack on hashtag BBC One has just said, I'm sorry, I passed out halfway through that. Can you explain it again slower? I think that was regarding the points rule there. But that is not getting the spirits of the fans down, that or the weather. They are very much dancing, waving, clapping in their seats. Well, at least some of the fans are. The director there doing an excellent cut to somebody who's looking a little less, a little more miserable, actually.
But isn't that what this racetrack is so good for, right? These fans are here because they are outright race fans, like Silverstone, like Suzuka. I know that there's a couple of grumpy faces and they've all got umbrellas up, but they're still having a great time, and that's what makes this race so special. It's the fans, the track itself. We may not be in the middle of a glitzy, glamorous city or in the middle of a wet forest in Belgium, but it's a wonderful racing spectacle, and that's why people come here.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And you know, it's the S tracks that seem to be the favoured ones: Spa, Suzuka, Silverstone.
Yeah.
But then, you know, talk about variety. I'd throw Singapore in there as well. You know, that is technically a temporary, more modern street track. It's been on the calendar for a long time, but people love Singapore.
Yeah,
it's great. It brings a whole new addition as well with the night race too. We were talking about what happens if qualifying cannot be completed, and the FIA had said, well, we're not going to go on the practice results. That's been agreed amongst the teams, and we were wondering what they were going to do. Well, Andrew Benson, the BBC chief F1 writer, has tweeted that further to this, the FIA has now confirmed that the grid will be set in championship order if qualifying cannot be run later today. So that would be, well, it would be Verstappen on pole, plus the 5-place grid penalty.
Yeah.
So Perez would actually get a better qualifying for a change. So it could well work out in the Mexicans' favour. It's not been a good time for Sergio Perez, really, since Monaco, where he, of course, started plumb last, crashed in qualifying, then Spain, started 11th, clawed his way up to 4th, Canada down in 12th, came back to 6th, 15th in Austria, Red Bull's home race, managed to recover back onto the podium, 15th again in Silverstone, got his way up to 6th, and then a better improved qualifying, but it was still only 9th in Hungary, back onto the podium. I'm grateful at least because it means we get some overtaking and some actions from one of the Red Bulls, but while Max Verstappen can win both the Drivers' and Constructors' Championship on his own, Red Bull, I imagine, don't really care too much.
Well, they don't care in terms of, you're right, they don't need him, and that such is the dominance of Max, they don't need him, but there will come a time when they do need him, and you know, maybe next year's car isn't quite so dominant, maybe others catch up, and absolutely then they're going to need him to be up there. I think this is a real key indicator of how much confidence plays into your physical ability to drive the car, how much the psychology of a driver has an impact on the physicality of being able to actually control this machine. We know that Sergio's got the talent and the skills to drive a car incredibly quickly. We've seen some wonderful performances from him, but as soon as that little bit of self-doubt creeps into your mind, or the speculation around your future starts being talked about, maybe the team not showing enough confidence in you at times, and your results then start to back that up, and before you know it, you've gone to this place in your mind when you can't quite commit to a corner, you want to back off a little, take less risks, all these things start to play in, and it spirals out of control. And we get to race day, we know how good Sergio can be because he can work his way through the field, but when he's under pressure on a Saturday, it feels, to me at least, like the pressure that's surrounding him in Formula 1 right now is really getting to him.
If he just needs to sort out that qualifying, and then he's there, absolutely, as you say. And he was coming under pressure from Fernando Alonso, was Perez, but he's now managed to eke that gap. He's got 32 points ahead of Alonso right now.
But is that not as much about Alonso falling back as it is Perez upping his game?
That's the issue, isn't it? And a 110-point gap between Verstappen and Perez is mighty. And actually, Andrew Benson has crunched the numbers in terms of when could he win the title.
Oh, yeah.
So Verstappen wins the title if... So right now he's, 110 points ahead of Perez. So he wins the title if he's 232 ahead after Italy, 206 ahead after Singapore, 180 ahead after Japan, and so on and so forth. So
it could be as early as Italy. That's crazy.
That could be.
I mean, that's a fairly extreme set of circumstances.
I mean, I would absolutely imagine the constructors will be sealed in Italy.
Well, that does depend on what Perez does to some extent, doesn't it? As we've got cars heading out of the garage again. 12 and a half minutes to go.
It can't be Italy. Japan is the real possibility in terms of drivers, but for teams, certainly, I think it can be.
Yeah, okay.
But for Japan, it's probably, and it has been one in Japan before.
Yeah,
many
well, it
times.
used to be at the end of the season, didn't it? So it was quite commonplace to win a title.
Well, let's not forget last year, right?
Oh, yeah. And that.
Remember that one? Verstappen, did he not? He did. If you're wondering why I've been talking so much, it's because there hasn't been that much track action on. But there is now. We had the red flag for Logan Sargent in the Williams, but that has been called in. We've been under green flag conditions for a little while now, but nobody's wanted to come out. But we now have some track action in the form of the man we've been talking about, Sergio Perez in his Red Bull, and the other Red Bull, Max Verstappen, after only doing one lap in the first half an hour, really, of practice, is now back out there. He's on the intermediate tyres. He's coming into the middle sector at the moment. He's 20th and last. He hasn't got a time on the board officially. So the two Red Bulls then running in these last 11 minutes and 46 seconds to see what the track conditions are like, because this is the one and only practice they get. They have to take as much learning that they can get from this. Conditions might well be similar for qualifying later, might be worse, might be slightly better, but you have to be out there to at least gather something, right?
Yeah, because the first time you get in your car, you know, in between races it gets completely stripped down, it gets rebuilt, you get new parts put on it. The first time you get in the car, it's as much about making sure the driver's comfortable, making sure that, you know, his seat hasn't moved, his belts are all adjusted the way they are, that he wants them, the pedals haven't changed. It's all that comfort, that stuff that you just need to make sure the surroundings, your environment is right. And then you've got to start figuring out how the car feels, because I'm sure for Max Verstappen, this car's so good that at every racetrack we go to, it feels pretty good. There'll be others around the grid that you might get in it for the first time on a race weekend and it surprises you how bad it is or how good it is. They are different at every circuit, and so these are important laps, and even for Max Verstappen, who has a clear advantage over the rest of the field, this is really valuable time. With only 10 minutes to go, he has to come out and start putting some laps on the board now.
And as you say that,
he doesn't. He's back in the pits. Brilliant.
I thought he was gearing up for a proper lap, or just at least going to come to an end of a lap, but he decides to bail out of it midway through the bus stop chicane and comes into the pits. As the rain pours, he pulls into his grid spot. The team of mechanics get to work and change those tyres. A quick bit of pit stop practice, and there are certainly puddles that are just developing in the pit lane as well. That is the ferocity of the rain that is coming down right now. The cloud cover, as we are in the Ardennes forest, but we're in a little bit of a bowl, really, slightly hilly around here, and the Spa-Francorchamps circuit, just over 7 kilometres long.
That bowl's filling up.
Well, exactly. It undulates in that bowl, and it's certainly, as Fernando Alonso makes his way downhill deeper into the bowl, it gets a little bit slippier and a little bit more wet, does Fernando Alonso, who I believe turns 42 tomorrow on Saturday. The oldest driver on the grid. Gets another year older.
I mean, if I wasn't older than him, I'd say that's really old, but actually it sounds quite young to me.
It's twice the age he was when he got his first pole and podium at the 2003 Malaysian Grand Prix.
Yeah, seems like a very long time ago. I mean, I worked with him, of course, back in 2007 at McLaren. He was just he was a world champion. He was already a double world champion. He was still very, very young. And I look back at the pictures of that particular year, and he's almost unrecognisable in terms of his baby face back then. But I think what we saw back then was that immense talent. Clearly, he was a double world champion. He's now paired that talent and grown it over the years, but paired it with the maturity and the experience, a little bit like Lewis Hamilton in the same way. He's now kind of got everything. He's got the raw speed and the talent, but he's also that wily fox. He knows how to manage a race. He knows how to work the rules. He can play the game now very, very well, and all of that is important.
Lance, rain is very heavy. We're boxing this lap.
So that was Lance Stroll, Alonso's teammate, being told to box this lap, and Fernando Alonso does the same thing as well. So the Aston Martin is not wanting to risk any possible damage from an aquaplane in these last 8 or so minutes. But again, we come back to this chat around who's the second fastest team. Aston Martin ahead of everybody bar Red Bull at the start of the year. What an amazing jump. They have fallen back in the last few races, but the team seem to say that that's more as a result of wrong choices on their side when it comes to setup and development, and now they need to rethink about which way they're going to go after the summer break.
Yeah, I think Silverstone was a real turning point for a lot of people. We got a new construction of tyre from Pirelli, and Pirelli will tell you there's no difference in performance, and that was very much the thinking behind the design, and the compounds are all exactly the same, just the construction of the tyre changes. But, you know, I know, and fans will know, that it only takes the tiniest difference, the tiniest tweak, and it can affects some cars differently. It might be how the tyre moves as it's going around the corner, how the energy's transferred through it by the smallest amount, and maybe that change is part of it. Maybe that hasn't helped the likes of Aston Martin, maybe it has helped McLaren, but also around Silverstone there's a key turning point for a lot of people bringing upgrades, and I think very clearly we can see from McLaren's perspective their upgrades have made a significant positive impact. Maybe at Aston Martin they haven't had the same.
Well, they brought some upgrades this weekend as well. Floor, a few bits to the floor, rear wing and the beam wing as well, but difficult to really get the full understanding of those when you do only have one practice session.
Yeah.
So upgrades, have been brought a fair bit. Alfa Romeo have brought some new bits along with Alpha Tauri, Williams, Mercedes as well have all brought a few bits and bobs. McLaren continually tweaking their big upgrades that they brought from the Austrian weekend onwards. But with 6.5 minutes left to go of this free practice one session, everybody has come into the pits, and we've got a fantastic helicopter shot. And if you squint, you can see the track because that is how low the cloud cover has come. It is quite misty. The rain is still very much falling. We are expecting this to continue into the afternoon and rain Saturday, maybe a little better on Sunday, which is why we're having all the questions about, well, what happens if the race doesn't get going, or if it's a shortened race, or how are we going to set the qualifying order if we can't qualify? That will be done via the championship order. So it's all a little bit up in the air at the moment, but it's not the best start to a weekend in terms of weather-wise.
The other thing with weather, and it's not just about the rain, but as you said, it can be very low cloud here. I've been here in the past when the cloud's been so low that it's in sort of foggy conditions, and then either the helicopter can't take off, the safety medical helicopter, or they have a rule that if you can't clearly see from one marshal's post to the next one because of thick fog, for example, again, that can be reason to cancel a session. So we're nowhere near that right now. It is raining, and it's raining very heavily, and there is low cloud. We're in conditions where I suspect we would be running if this was a competitive session, but with 5 minutes left to go on a practice session with very high risk, given that we've got qualifying this afternoon. If you damage your car now, with 5 minutes to go, you're potentially in trouble. I think people are now starting to see the risk versus reward factor as not being great enough to get out of the garage.
Yeah, well, just less than 5 minutes to go. We're just seeing Franz Tost, the team principal of Alpha Tauri, get off the pit wall and walk into the garage on Daniel Ricciardo's side and have a little look around. Meanwhile, over at Haas, the team principal, Gunther Steiner, is still sat on the pit wall and sheltering from the rain, and we can hear a car firing up in the background, so we may well get a little bit more track action. Yeah, it might be Charles Leclerc in his Ferrari. He has got back into his cockpit and is gearing up to get out there with 4 minutes and 20 seconds to go. His gloves being placed in front of him, and as he gets belted in, and the steering wheel then is placed into the steering rack. So Leclerc, he might get lucky. The same with Valtteri Bottas too.
This is really interesting in that we could, as I said, 4 minutes to go. We've got 5 drivers here who still haven't set a time. Sargent, Stroll, Gasly, Ocon and Max Verstappen still haven't done a complete timed lap. And that means they're going to go into qualifying with that as their backdrop. So, Max Verstappen and those other drivers we just talked about will go into turn 1 for the very first time in qualifying.
Well, Sargent crashed the car, so
that's true. So he's done it.
But yeah. Stroll, absolutely right. He's on. He did 5 laps. My producer's looking at me. He did crash the car. Sargent, red flag. That was the reason for the red flag. Stroll did 5 laps, but didn't complete any, or didn't at least set a competitive lap time. Gasly 2 on the board. Ocon 2. Verstappen 2.
But they're only out.
But they're only out laps.
So they haven't gone into turn 1
full speed. Yeah, exactly.
Or at all, because they go out the pits.
Of course,
and they come back round and back in the pits.
They cut it out.
They would literally, if it stays with 3 minutes to go, the first experience of jumping on the brakes at relatively high speed into turn 1 will be when it really matters in qualifying.
I kind of like it like this, though.
I love it. I love it.
Now I'm comparing, particularly from a broadcast perspective, 3 practice sessions versus 1 practice session straight into quali. I quite like it like that because you're just straight into the weekend.
Yeah, agreed.
And you're putting the teams and the drivers on the back foot. If you have an incident in practice, that really does hamper you. If you've brought upgrades, you have to make the most of it in that short allotted time.
Yeah.
And it just makes a bigger emphasis on actually practice and how crucial it can be.
I 100% agree. I think that's great. There is an argument to say that Formula One teams, and it's not their fault, but Formula One teams are often over-prepared by the time we get to the really important sessions. Of course, that's what they need to do. That's what they should be doing. That's their job. But with a sprint weekend, this is what we get. We get less practice time. I mean, the argument against it is that the teams like Red Bull and Max Verstappen, who perhaps don't need as much practice time, will still be better served, whereas the teams that really need to start fine-tuning their car more significantly will be hampered. But I think this unpredictability that it generates can be a good thing.
Brave from Charles Leclerc, and I think that is Valtteri Bottas in the Alfa Romeo. There's a couple of cars that are actually coming out. It's the Alfa Romeo first, followed by Leclerc in the Ferrari. It's actually Zhou Guanyu. I apologise, it's not Valtteri Bottas, it's Zhou Guanyu. Actually, no, I apologise again, it's both Alfa Romeos. They're both going out. And the Ferraris. And this is very heavy rain that they're experiencing right now. They're all on the full wet tyre.
Are they going out to do practice starts on the grid?
With 1:13, quite possibly. But they are all doing a little practice start out of the end of the pit lane as they trawl out. But is anybody else joining them? Yes. So Hamilton's going out too. Sainz as well. So I think you've nailed it on the head there, Mark.
Well, a start at the end of the pit lane is one thing, which they do at almost every time they exit the pit lane. They'll run through a practice start, and it just helps to get the settings correct. But a start on the grid, which is of course where it will happen when it really matters, it can be very different. It's a different bit of tarmac, often at a different level. The pit lane goes out at an angle, whereas the grid is typically a bit flatter. There are grooves across the pit lane here at Spa to help drain some of that water. That affects how much grip you have. So getting a real life practice start in on the grid, albeit in very wet conditions, could be something really valuable for the engineers in the weekend.
Charles Leclerc makes his way downhill through the right-hander of Beau Rivage. Next up will be the long double left-hander of Pouon as he gets into the second half of this Spa-Francorchamps circuit, and just tentatively making his way around that double left-hander, the spray kicking up over all four wheels as we lose sight of the Ferrari. That's the amount of spray Leclerc is kicking up. This is the sound on board Lewis Hamilton as he just struggles to get it turned in through Beau Rivage, the right-hander. Then comes the left-hander of turn 9.
The other real challenge here is because the circuit is so undulating, the amount of water we've got, of course, does start to form rivers. It literally runs down the circuit, and you can find yourself going into a corner at the bottom of a hill with a river running across the circuit, and that very easy to sort of aquaplane where the bottom of the car just bottoms out on the surface of the water and you go flying.
We've certainly seen some incidents over the years where they just catch a puddle, catch a river, and you lose all control. This is a good example that we're witnessing at the moment of just the amount of visibility available. Lewis Hamilton, the Mercedes, is right in front of Carlos Sainz in the Ferrari as they come into the latter half of this track through Stavolo, and approaching then the fast left-hand kink that brings you through Blanchimont, and you just cannot see Carlos Sainz.
There's no way Carlos Sainz must be able to see
In fact, he
anything.
even runs out wide. We can't see Sainz through the cameras. Sainz absolutely cannot see what's in front of him. Lewis Hamilton is only a few metres in front of him. Sainz does know that, and you can just see how much he backs off to allow him some room as they do make their way to the grid.
It's almost a bit of a test what he was doing there, I think, wasn't it? Just to see whether he ducks out from behind the rear wing of the Mercedes, how much that improves. And this is all useful stuff to learn, of course, because this could happen on race day.
And as they line up on the grid, the visibility is such worsening that we can't see Carlos Sainz until he gets to the braking zone of turn 1. That is how much rain is falling, that's how low the cloud cover is. Sainz does carry through. The checkered flag is out, and Sainz with the fastest time with a 2:03.2 on the intermediate tyres will go around again, and as did Hamilton as well. So he allowed himself some room. This is riding on board with the sounds of Carlos Sainz up through the gears. And you're a brave man if you go completely flat out, even on the Kemmel Straight in these conditions.
Do you remember, it's been doing the rounds on social this week, the clip of Kimi, and there was a blow-up, I think, from Jarno Trulli's Toyota or something, where one of the old days of massive engine blow-ups, and he went into a cloud of thick white smoke, did not lift. I mean, on one hand, you could say it's absolutely, what a lunatic. On the other hand, he went on to set an unbelievable lap, but he went into it utterly blind. And this is the problem that you have at circuits like this, in conditions like this, you're going into a committed lap on occasions, if you're behind someone else, blindly. You can't see what's on the other side of that spray, and if someone's stopped, if someone's had a spin, you are literally a passenger, and that's the problem that Formula One is facing right now, off the back of some tragic events in conditions not too dissimilar to this.
Absolutely, and Pierre Gasly was actually leading a run yesterday for members of the paddock to run this circuit. And remember the life sadly lost of Antoine Hubert in 2019 and Delano Van 't Hoff just about a month or so ago really at this track in similar conditions. So it really has rocked the motorsport world in recent times, and particularly at this track as well. But it was a lovely celebration there. You can see it on Pierre Gasly's social media as well. It's wonderful to see that taking place. Well, the checkered flag has come out then, and they're all making their way on their final lap. Sainz and Hamilton decided they wanted to go out with about a minute to go, and Sainz really clouts that. The first inside curve for the bus stop chicane in his Ferrari, as his teammate Leclerc appears from out of the mist and through into La Source. Now, I don't know, we haven't seen anybody stop on the start-finish straight to do
well, we should see Sainz. Is Sainz formed up on the grid now?
Well, this is what I would like to see. But meanwhile, we're seeing Leclerc, and he's got a bit of spray in front of him as he brakes for the bus stop chicane. It's the Alfa Romeo, but he locks up the front right and goes deep into the corner, but not too deep. He's able to still get it turned right and able to rejoin the track.
Yeah, so absolutely treacherous, and I'm not sure, was that a start?
I think that was. So that was Kevin Magnussen in the Haas, who was just doing a standing start there. So I suspect Sainz did one as well, but they didn't show it to us. So a couple of them getting some practice starts in the books then, and that brings us to an end, really, of free practice one. So a very interesting session there. A little bit of running, but the main question will be, how will the weather continue throughout the weekend? We now, because it's a sprint race weekend, we go into Grand Prix qualifying later this afternoon. So do join us here on the BBC Sport website and app from 3:55 in the UK. But at the end of that free practice one session, it was Carlos Sainz fastest ahead of Piastri, Norris, Leclerc, Perez, Albon, Tsunoda, Magnussen, Ricciardo and Hülkenberg the top 10, but difficult to read too much into those times at this stage. How will qualifying unfold? That's the big question mark, with Max Verstappen, our championship leader, also facing a 5-place grid penalty. Do join us from 3:55 this afternoon for qualifying. Thank you to Mark Priestley. I've been Harry Benjamin. This has been an IMG production for BBC Radio 5 Live.